The Third Succession War had been lingering on for over a century and a half come 3020. More than 230 years had passed since the opening salvos of the First Succession War. There was no one alive in the Inner Sphere who could still remember a time of peace. A quarter millennia of carnage had brought about a technological regression that left many worlds in the 31st century with a quality of life that would have been seen as poor by even 21st century standards. The notion that the great houses are still vying for the privilege of ruling over a reformed Star League after this much time is laughable. It was naught but their own hubris and a desire for vengeance that had kept them going through generations of bloodshed. With the exception of a few glory hounds who had taken to the field in person, most of the successor lords had remained cooped up in their ivory towers, far removed from the realities of the endless war they were propagating. But there were some who felt that things had gone on long enough. Archon Katrina Steiner desired to see the eternal conflict concluded. She didn't care whether or not her dynasty would prevail over the other successor states. Her concerns were merely for the people of the Lyran Commonwealth. It was for this reason that she followed in the footsteps of her ancestor Elizabeth Steiner and issued a peace proposal to the other great houses. The response was mixed. Maximilian Liao had lost far too much territory to consider agreeing to the terms of the ceasefire, which would have frozen all existing borders, not to mention the fact that he still dreamed of one day sitting on the Star League throne, and so had no interest in ending the war. The chauvinistic Takeshi Kurita saw it as a typically womanly gesture, unbecoming of a true warrior. Janos Marik believed it was another Lyran trick and paid it no heed at all. Those three all turned her down. The proposal arrived at New Avalon within the Federated Suns on June 22, 3020. A decade earlier, Ian Davion had met with Katrina at Tharkad, where the two heads of state made their first tentative steps towards an alliance. Steiner's call for peace was perhaps nothing more than a test to get a sense for the younger brother's feelings on the matter. As it happened, Hansa Davion proved amenable to the idea. Though publicly he rejected the terms of her ceasefire, having already made a bold promise to reclaim every world lost to the Draconis Combine during the First Succession War, in secret he opened a dialogue with the Lyran Commonwealth, discussing areas where they might collaborate. Hansa Davion's ambitious venture to recover all of his family's former holdings began in 3020. Their Corwood border had been almost completely static following Kurita's defeat at Mallory's World 4 years earlier. During the long stagnant period of that campaign, other elements of the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery had seized nearby Mara. This is where the armed forces of the Federated Suns would strike first, dispatching 2 of their Avalon Hussar regiments to liberate the system. The planet was retaken, but losses were considerable. The 34th and 36th were reformed into the 42nd in the aftermath. The fight to reclaim Ronal and Royal was a mirror image. Again, the AFFS were victorious, but the Crucis Lancers were badly bloodied in the case of the former, and the Deneb Light Cavalry paid a heavy cost in their assault too. Elsewhere, strikes against Dobson and Yance softened up defences in preparation for future advances. But further operations around the Terran Corridor were halted when the Capellan Confederation armed forces raided New Roads. The DCMS was preparing for their own counterattack in 3020. Harrow's son was their chosen target, dispatching 4 battlemech units to defeat those in garrison. Even in the face of 2-to-1 odds, the AFFS were not prepared to abandon their position. They managed to hold out in the mountainous countryside until reinforcements arrived in system. The Kuritans withdrew before they made landfall. Despite this success, it was clear that the Draconis Combine was not going to give up their hold of the region without a fight, and in truth, nor should anyone have expected them to. In the case of planets lost during those early days of the First Succession War, they'd now been under occupation for more than 2 centuries, and were firmly in support of House Kurita. The dichotomy between historical claims and present-day allegiance is one of the factors that makes continuing conflict inevitable. Katrina Steiner's peace proposal may have netted her a potential ally in Hansa Davion, but the other successor lords had responded with scorn. Perhaps believing that the Archon's call for a ceasefire was indicative of a realm on its last legs, both of her immediate neighbours went on the offensive. The Freewells League front quickly proved to be a non-starter. The Marik militia failed in their raid on Olgrab, although a sister regiment did do well holding off a reprisal action at Callison. The Sky Rangers had greater success against the Regulan Hussars at Amity. The Draconis Combine posed a far greater threat. For the 5th time in the Third Succession War, the planet Severin once again changed hands in 3020, making it perhaps the most hotly contested world anywhere in the Inner Sphere. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces next took the fight to Marfik, but the invasion was halted by an up-and-coming DCMS officer, Vasily Cherenkov, and ownership of Marfik is still contested to this day. The man would become the bane of all Lyrans in the coming years, following an appointment to the position of Warlord of Dieron. If the LCAF was not capable of holding back the tide, Steiner would need to find an alternative source of strength. Her solution lay in the acquisition of several famous mercenary groups and the redeployment of others to the Kuritan front. The big signing came early in the spring of 3020. Wolf's Dragoons accepted a 5-year contract with House Steiner. Janos Marik, underwhelmed by their inability to A. destroy the facilities on Hesperus, or B. die in the attempt, made no efforts to counter the offer. As they had experienced following Anton's revolt, Wolf's people were not met with open arms. The decision to hire mercenaries that had so recently fought against them proved a contentious one. Duke Aldo Lestrade wanted vengeance for the damage done to his realm, whereas Simon Johnson, Chancellor of the Lyran Intelligence Corps, was certain that the Dragoons were more than just soldiers for hire. There was too much about their history which didn't add up. In spite of the naysayers, the Archon's will won out, and the mercenaries took up station on Mysore. Another of Katrina's favourites also returned to the Commonwealth later that year. The Kellhounds, though much reduced in size, had re-established themselves as an efficient battalion of veterans. Their homecoming after a decade in foreign service proved less contentious. Additionally, the 12th Star Guard, then based in the Federated Suns, were hired to return Alexandria to Steiner rule. Supporting them in this action were Snord's Irregulars, the first time they had engaged a non-Marik foe. Unfortunately for the light-fingered mercs, the museum artworks they had hoped to liberate were casualties of the fighting there. Eager to impress her new friend across the Inner Sphere, Katrina put Wolf's Dragoons to work against their mutual enemy, the Draconis Combine. While the main body of the brigade continued to rebuild, the Black Widows, operating out of Chukchi 3, were dispatched in early 3021 for a raid against the DCMS's forward base on New Wessex. Defending the planet was a second-line mixed regiment under Shosho Jinjiro Yamashiga, and more notably, the Waco Rangers, famous rivals of Wolf's Dragoons. Natasha Kirensky established her camp within the vast forest known as Harlow's Wood, hidden beneath the Great Canopy. They would venture forth unpredictably to strike at various targets, then withdraw back into the darkness. Jinjiro broke his unit into individual lances to try and locate the elusive Black Widows, but soon came to regret this decision. 2/3 of his regiment were picked off in the gloom. Having lost a pair of battalions to a single company, the only remaining option available to Yamashita was seppuku. Wayne Waco had better success, locating Natasha's dropship and closing in for the kill. Kerensky had seen the Rangers coming, however, and lifted off without further incident. To regain the initiative, the 5th Sword of Light assigned an elite company of mechs led by the warlord of Razelhaig's nephew to raid the planets Fatima, Fort Ludon, Morningside, and Pandora. This newly formed unit, known as Sorensen's Sabres, quickly established a brutal reputation for themselves, targeting civilian infrastructure and reveling in the chaos this caused. Incensed by this barbaric conduct, the 12th Lyran Guards dispatched one of their battalions to La Blanc on October 3, 3021, in order to hunt the war criminals down. Unfortunately, the ruthless MechWarriors were able to outmaneuver their opponents and escape the noose. September 3021 saw the beginning of 2 large battles involving the Draconis Combine, one along each of their borders. Scouts had landed on New Iverson and found it to be poorly defended, and so a regiment of the Galladan regulars were dispatched to seize it. Although much of the planetary militia was quickly overcome, the underwater command control and communications complex remained out of their reach. Submarines operating in the theatre made short work of the slow and plodding battle mechs that dared venture into their territory. This proved decisive when the Draconis March militia arrived 2 weeks later, as it allowed them to coordinate their actions more effectively and rout the invaders from their world. Across the realm, Wolf's Dragoon's next target was the world of Dromini 6. With 2 regiments of the Dieron regulars in garrison, Jamie dispatched a larger force to counter them, Alpha, Delta, and Epsilon. This would be the first outing for Colonel Kathleen Dumont, after the legendary Sarah Weiss had chosen to retire from active service the previous year. Likewise, Baxter Arbuthnot, who had taken command of Epsilon after the death of Harold Jones on Hesperus, was now acting as their senior officer. While her fellow colonels sparred with the DCMS, Kathleen headed towards the small town of Drachau, where she intended to set up her headquarters. Failing to adequately scout the area ahead, Dumont's regiment stumbled straight into a minefield and was forced to a halt. At this moment, the 2nd Sword of Light, a unit which had only just arrived at Dromini ahead of Wolf's Dragoons, descended on the trapped mercenaries. They took heavy casualties trying to extricate themselves from the quagmire. Jamie Wolf, meanwhile, was in a fight for his life. Alpha's battle against the Dieron regulars was going well, but his command lance was ambushed by the local Dromini Ducal Armoured Hussars. Isolated from the rest of his unit, the colonel called upon every ounce of talent available to him in order to survive the skirmish. His mech, however, did not. Before any friendly forces could come to his aid, the Sword of Light stumbled upon him first. Unable to fight back, Jamie simply waited to die. But the killing blow never came. Commanding the recon company was Minobu Tetsuhara. In accordance with his own strict moral compass, the Taii ordered his unit to continue onwards, allowing the incapacitated MechWarrior a chance to withdraw so that he might fight and die with honor at another time, in line with the precepts of Bushido. Wulf's ruined archer was so badly mauled that no one recognised it as the one belonging to the Inner Sphere's most famous colonel. Minobu's decision came at great cost to both the Draconis Combine and to himself. The Kuritans had exploited the sudden confusion within Wulf's Dragoons' ranks after the loss of their commander and were driving the mercenaries back. But once Jaime was recovered, he hardened their resolve and turned the tide of battle against the DCMS. Ultimately, they had to call in reinforcements, but here the second hidden phase of the operation kicked into action. Waiting in orbit were 3 regiments of the Donegal Guards, who ambushed the oblivious troops sent to relieve the garrison. They inflicted brutal casualties, forcing the defenders to withdraw in the weeks that followed. Tetsuhara, meanwhile, faced the full brunt of Kuritan hypocrisy. The identity of the wounded soldier whom he had spared was kept hidden from him. Though he received a promotion for embodying the ideals of the samurai, he was simultaneously stripped of his family mech and cashiered out of active duty. Thus, the Shosa was permanently disgraced for letting the opportunity to kill the legendary Jaime Wulf slip through his fingers. The end of Anton's revolt did not mark the end of political division within the Freewells League. Even within the ruling Marik family, members competed with one another to secure their position in the line of succession. The 2 frontrunners were Janosch's 4th child, Duggan, MP for the Marik Commonwealth, and his nephew, Duncan, Supreme Commander of the Marik Militia. The former held sway among the nation's politicians, whereas the latter was more popular among the military. Duncan interpreted the Captain General's apparent refusal to name his eldest surviving son as heir to be proof that he was the favourite of the 2, and frequently stated as much when interviewed. But as it turned out, neither had a read on the successor lord's true feelings. In 3021, Janosch journeyed to Procyon. He had a proposal to make to ComStar. 15 years earlier, Thomas Marik, the last son to be born of his father's first marriage, had enrolled in the Sacred Order. In that time, he had served with the Explorer Corps, qualified in the fields of medicine and astrophysics, and later held the position of Deputy Chief of Maintenance for several hyperpulse generator stations. Believing that Thomas had been effectively shielded from the treachery and sedition of Freewells League government, his father decided that it was he who should ultimately succeed him as Captain General when the time came. While watching events in his home nation from afar, he could train in politics and diplomacy, safely removed from any provincial influence and protected from potential fratricide. Primus Julian Tiepolo agreed to a secret provision that would allow the younger Marik to continue to serve ComStar until the time came for him to depart for the successor state. Such an arrangement also promised to one day fulfill St. Raymond Karpov's dream of taking over the Freewells League entirely. The Marik faction wasn't the only one in turmoil. In 3021, the Regulan half of Tiber rose in revolt, some wishing to merge with the Duchy of New Assam. House Cameron Jones deployed some of their own troops to suppress the rebellion. This internal dispute is still going on to this day, with some of the Regulan Hussars even defecting to the other side. While these political games occupied the politicians, the Capellan front continued to bubble away with numerous raids. The Duchy of Andurian came under attack at Shiro III, after which the 3rd Defenders pursued them back across the border to Betelgeuse. At the opposite end of the realm, Nanking was also targeted by the League in 3021. The spare parts seized by the 6th Marik militia were instrumental in allowing the brigade to rebuild their 4th Regiment, lost in the near collapse that followed the ComStar War, and return them to the roles of the FWLM. For the past 2 centuries, ComStar had been clandestinely working to fulfill a hidden mandate, continuing the succession wars at any cost. Although the various primacies had waxed and waned on just how much interference they should exert in order to prolong the conflict, all believed it was their destiny to one day inherit control of the inner sphere after the great houses finally collapsed into ruin. Katrina Steiner's historic peace proposal imperiled that divine plan. Reports that Hansa Davion had responded warmly, and that the two might even enter into an alliance together, perhaps one strong enough to unite humanity behind a single banner, caused considerable consternation within their ranks. Several of the First Circuit called for immediate action before it was too late. Primus Julian Tiepolo saw things differently. He believed that this was a great opportunity to be exploited. The Third Succession War, despite keeping the Inner Sphere locked in a seemingly endless grind, had caused far less destruction than the comparatively brief First and Second conflicts. Things had stagnated, but an alliance promised to change all of that. Julian was convinced that when the other successor states caught wind of the agreement, they too would align with each other, dividing mankind into 2 great power blocks that would inevitably come to blows, bringing about the apocalypse that the fabled Jerome Blake had foreseen so many years ago. Far from intervening to prevent Davion and Steiner from reaching an accord, Tiepolo actively encouraged it, facilitating communication between them. He reasoned that if such a union was to go ahead, it would be beneficial if his organization had a hand in its creation to better exert their influence in the future. After 16 months of difficult but fruitful talks, representatives from the Federated Suns and Lyran Commonwealth travelled to ComStar's Hilton Head headquarters on Earth. The proposed bill, known as the Federated Commonwealth Accords, contained provisions for the sharing of military, scientific, and industrial secrets, the latter of particular interest to the Spinwood realm, whose economy badly needed some additional stimulus. It would also open many academies and universities to prospective students from the other side, including the prestigious New Avalon Institute of Science. Perhaps more significantly, their respective intelligence agencies would collaborate on identifying Draconis Combine troop dispositions, allowing both nations to exploit the weaknesses in their common foe's defensive line. In view of the assembled dignitaries and a delegation from the First Circuit, Hansa Davion and Katrina Steiner signed the historic document on May 8, 3022. The status quo had been shattered. Shortly thereafter, Brom leaked word of the Fedcom Accords to the other great houses. The response from those 3 successor states was immediate. They condemned the alliance as a prelude to a heightened state of war, one far more destructive than the limited objective raids they had become accustomed to. Each saw themselves becoming the main target for the hypothetical armed forces of the Federated Commonwealth. It was Chancellor Maximilian Liao who blinked first. Emissaries were dispatched to Takashi Kurita. The hope was to establish a counter-alliance between their 2 states, but the coordinator was initially unreceptive to the idea of acknowledging one so far beneath him as an equal. At some point in the weeks that followed, Takashi must have had a change of heart after recognizing just how precarious his position was. He began making overtures of his own. In September 3022, Subhash Indrahar of Kurita's internal security force travelled to the Free Worlds League in person and requested an audience with the Captain General. Janosch, who was intensely distrustful at the best of times, anticipated treachery from the man they called the Smiling One, and the director in turn must have expected the same. Despite an initially frosty reception, they actually found each other's company quite palatable. At some point, the topic of a potential ceasefire and trade partnership was raised, something which Marik was more than amenable to. Later that month, the two men met again, this time on Terra. Also in attendance was the coordinator of the Draconis Combine, the first time either House Lord had met with another of their kind during the Succession Wars. There was one more person present at the Schloss Elmau Alpine Retreat that autumn. Unbeknownst to the Captain General, Takashi had invited Maximilian Liao to their secret conference as well. This many heads of state hadn't been seen together in one room since the dying days of the Star League. Janosch almost reflexively backed out of the deal at the mere sight of the loathsome Chancellor, but Kurita made it clear to him that any potential alliance between their nations could only go ahead if all three parties were involved. The Diablo didn't make things easy for Marik, as he offhandedly remarked that he had met with his traitorous brother under similar circumstances 8 years prior, when the two of them had conspired to launch Anton's revolt. Nevertheless, after a week of intense discussions, on October 13th, the trio collectively agreed in principle to the terms of what later became known as the Concord of Captain. This treaty opened the door for a technological exchange program, as well as trade agreements for battle mechs, research, and intelligence. Nothing formal was signed as of yet, but the situation was certainly developing as Primus Julian Tiepolo had anticipated. Right from the outset, the collaboration between Davion and Steiner proved an immediate boon for both of their respective militaries. Together, their two intelligence agencies were able to confirm the location of nearly every frontline battlemech regiment within the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery. The armed forces of the Federated Sons wasted no time in exploiting this information by launching a new offensive in 3022, successfully capturing a quartet of worlds: Galatia, Galtor, Marduk, and Rome, taking the First Prince one step closer to fulfilling his promise of recovering all of their former holdings. An unsanctioned counterattack on Kosa 7 was launched by an irate Kuritan officer, but proved to be a disaster for him. In an effort to further strengthen ties between the two nations, Marshal Ran Felsner travelled across the border with his first Davion guards to Rigel Kentaris at the invitation of Margrave Jack Spire. Once there, the two intended to participate in military maneuvers together, but the plan went awry when the Draconis Combine chose that moment to crash their party. A multi-regiment DCMS invasion force unwittingly stumbled into the exercise, and a titanic scrap kicked off. Despite the challenges in coordinating their efforts, the Allies managed to force the mustered soldiery to abandon their campaign. In gratitude for his assistance in defending the Lyran Commonwealth, Archon Katrina Steiner presented Ran Felsner with the prestigious Mackenzie Hammer, a 9-kilo solid silver trophy. At home, the First Prince awarded him the Order of Davion, as well as a promotion to Field Marshal. The following year, he was appointed to the newly created position of Commander of the Royal Brigade of Guards, a title which placed nearly 100 elite regiments under his authority, making him among the most powerful men anywhere in the Inner Sphere. It was clear to Coordinator Takashi Kurita that his counterpart, Hansa Davion, was a greater threat to his realm than any other successor lord in recent memory. In his brief tenure as First Prince, he had won several decisive victories, made unprecedented steps towards recovering lost tech, and forged an alliance that threatened to relegate the Draconis Combine to the status of a mere minor power. The solution to this problem seemed simple: cut the head off the snake. Assigned to this task were the newly formed Night Stalkers. Retired Taisa Lloyd McGavin had formed the unit 2 years prior from other aging MechWarriors at the ends of their careers, who wished to continue their service to the Dragon beyond what the regulars would traditionally allow. The warlords viewed these soldiers as washed up and unreliable, but that made them perfect disposable assets for what was considered a suicide mission. One battalion was selected for an all-or-nothing raid against New Avalon itself, with orders to kill or capture the First Prince. They reached their destination in late 3022, bypassing the capital's security measures and making landfall outside the ruling family's winter palace. The Davion guards immediately deployed to defend their lord from the threat. Despite the Night Stalkers' best efforts, they quickly found themselves outnumbered and unable to reach their target. Miraculously, some survivors were able to make it off-world and back to the Combine, although virtually their entire aerospace complement was wiped out trying to get clear of New Avalon. Undeterred by the attempt on his life, Hansa Davion pressed ahead with his campaign. The following year, he dispatched McKinnon's raiders to Fallon for the second time in recent memory, while larger formations of the AWFS reclaimed Bergman's planet and Tancredi 4. Momentum was clearly in his favour, but he would not get to enjoy this success for much longer. Takashi Kurita had just acquired a new unit that would soon turn the situation on its head. In the final years of the Second Succession War, the Federated Sons launched an attack against the Capellan Confederation capital, which ultimately resulted in the complete capitulation of the Liao Chancellor and official acknowledgement of their recent conquests. Perhaps hoping to achieve similar results now that the third conflict was clearly winding down, Smithson's Chinese bandits were dispatched in 3022 to strike at Cyan once more. But this time around, there was a fundamental difference. Maximilian was not Dainmar. The Liao Chancellor did not hide in a bunker as his predecessor had, and instead took to the field himself to organize the defense. With his leadership, the Chesterton reserves in garrison were able to see off the mercenaries before they could inflict serious damage. Davion would come to rue signing off on such an audacious operation. The enraged Capellan successor lord demanded retribution, and he went to Archibald McCarron to see that he got it. The 5 regiments of his armoured cavalry were perhaps the strongest single unit in service to Liao at that time, and the second largest mercenary command in existence. Normally held back as a mobile reserve, for the first time in decades they were let off the leash to cause as much destruction within the Federated Sons as possible. The campaign that followed would see more than a dozen worlds burn. McCarron's Long March began in August 3022, when Liao JumpShips moved across the border to take up pre-arranged positions throughout the region. This would allow for the Big Mac to redeploy far quicker than if they had to wait for their own transports to recharge. It was a risky gamble, but the irreplaceable craft luckily went unnoticed. Maskarovka agents intensified their activity as they worked to identify the best targets of opportunity ahead of the invasion. The armoured cavalry were divided into 3 task groups for their mission. The elite 1st Regiment planned to move independently as they struck at valuable infrastructure, while the others operated in pairs and made the elimination of hostile units their priority. Archie himself chose to accompany the 2nd and 5th Regiments. The assault commenced with simultaneous strikes in November. The 1st succeeded in destroying the ore refinery at Farwell, while the other 2 task groups used their overwhelming numbers to eradicate the defenders at Cathal and Tawas. By using the jumpship command circuit they had set up, McCarron's armoured cavalry was able to redeploy to their follow-up targets faster than the armed forces of the Federated Suns could respond to. Their next objectives were a 2nd refinery on McHenry, where another large mercenary command in the employ of Davion sustained 2 battalions worth of casualties, and the agricultural stores on Muskegon. Combining his strength for the first time during the Long March, Archie McCarron led the Big Mac to Marlette. While most of them were raiding the world for anything of value, Marcus Barton launched an assault on Fort Bourgogne, one of 5 major bases for the Capellan March militia. A 3-day siege saw the massive complex razed to the ground, cementing the colonel's nickname as Fort Buster Barton, but also his reputation as a loose cannon. The 2nd Regiment sustained such heavy losses that they were effectively relegated to a support role for the rest of the campaign. While all this was going on, Maximilian Liao was making an audacious voyage of his own. Travelling incognito across the border into the Federated Suns, his entourage touched down on the planet Lee. The purpose of this journey was one he was well familiar with by this point. Awaiting his arrival was none other than Michael Hasek Davion, leader of the Capellan March. Like Anton Marik before him, the Duke of New Syrtis began a dialogue with the scheming successor lord, laying the groundwork for a mutual non-aggression pact between them. The Chancellor's offer to gift him the planets Jonathan and Remshield in exchange for turning on his brother-in-law was turned down, but there's no doubt the traitorous March Lord still harbours ambitions of one day assuming the mantle of First Prince for himself. McCarron's armoured cavalry marched on into 3023. The 3 task groups began the year with coinciding attacks against the repair facilities on Goshen and other agricultural centres at Emerson and Smolensk, but it was their next strike at Beitin Kaitos in March where the AFFS was finally able to pin them down. A detachment of the Davion Guards faced off with Archibald on the field in a 2-day running gun battle. Despite their best efforts, the mercenary colonel was able to extract his unit in good order, in thanks to a timely intervention from the remnants of Marcus Barton's command. Not prepared to risk becoming outnumbered again, the Big Mac once more consolidated their strength and pressed on to Bristol. This was not one of the Long March's designated targets, but they had an ulterior motive for being there. Now on the alert, the Federated Suns redeployed as many neighbouring units as they could to the planet, but when the reinforcements arrived, they found that the whole operation had been a ruse. The armoured cavalry had departed days earlier to strike at the weakened garrison on Listowel. The raid there gave them enough resources to move on to the final 2 objectives, Myra and Messertim. Once more, they unleashed terrible destruction on the locals before finally heading for home. The Chancellor himself was waiting to greet the mercenaries upon their arrival at Tikhonov in September 3023. They were received by the public with tremendous fanfare, and Maximilian Liao awarded all the unit commanders with medals, honours, and landholds for their service. McCarron's Long March is unquestionably the greatest success of any offensive undertaken by the Capellan Confederation in the past 2 centuries. Although no worlds changed hands, The results were ruinous for the armed forces of the Federated Suns and the Davion realm at large. It was also yet another nail in the coffin of the Third Succession War. First Prince Hansa Davion was faced with the uncomfortable possibility that he might not have enough strength remaining for him to defeat their arch-nemesis, the Draconis Combine. In the final weeks of 3022, Archon Katrina Steiner received some unwelcome news. Despite their generous treatment of the famed mercenaries in helping them rebuild from the losses sustained on Hesperus, Jamie Wolfe was electing to make use of the exit clause in their contract. Effective immediately, he and his compatriots were now servants of the Dragon. The blow was only somewhat softened by the knowledge that their new deal forbade them from being used against the Lyran Commonwealth. It was small consolation for the Lyrans when the Waco Rangers honoured their blood feud and switched sides in order to ensure they never fought alongside their hated rivals. Exactly why the veteran colonel cut short their employment with Steiner is unknown. Some say it was merely the lucrative offer on the table that swayed him, the highest ever payment for a single unit. Maybe it was the increased operational freedom he had bargained for. Perhaps it was the dissident factions within the Lyran nobility that drove them out. Others have speculated that there had been a change in philosophy among their commanders following their to-date final voyage out of the Inner Sphere to their supply base in 3019. The rumours that Wolfe's Dragoons were testing each of the successor states' martial strength in turn for some hidden power in the deep periphery only increased now that they had completed the set by signing on with the Draconis Combine. Whatever their motives, the brigade departed Mysore in early 3023 and spent the next 3 months transitioning across to the Federated Suns border. Beta and most of the specialist battalions escorted their dependents, along with Hephaestus Station, to their new home base at Anting, but the other units were diverted to the front lines to participate in a pair of surprise raids, a surprise to both Davion and Wolfe's Dragoons alike. First to see battle in service to Kurita was Epsilon and the Black Widows, who touched down on Hoth in April, reinforcing the Galladan regulars already on World. Their target was an NAIS research base at Fryden Aerospace Park, where work was underway to develop enhanced heat sinks. Defending the complex were 4 battalions of the legendary Iridani Light Horse, arguably one of only 3 other mercenary groups of comparable reputation to the Dragoons. The initial engagements were not promising for the new hires. Natasha Kirensky's skill in battle won them several hard-fought local victories, but the state-of-the-art technology retrofitted to the ELH mechs was allowing them to inflict significant damage on Epsilon. May 1st was a turning point in the campaign. A lack of communication from the Kuritan Taisa saw him advance without support, leaving a hole in the Dragoon line that the opposing mercs were quick to exploit. The death of their commander sent the Galladan regulars into a rout, forcing Colonel Arbuthnot to fall back to a secondary defensive position. 10 days later, the ELH and supporting Draconis March militia units were throwing everything they could at the invaders, but it was to no avail. With the Black Widows leading the charge, Epsilon regained the initiative and drove them all the way back to the target facility. Alas, by the time they got there, it had been cleared out by its occupants, the databanks scrubbed clean. Wolfe's Dragoons left Hoth with only the most cursory intel on what research had been conducted there, and had to be content with simply disrupting the operation. Just a few weeks later, an even larger force was materializing at the Quinton system on June 4th. Alpha, Gamma, Delta, and the Orbital Aerospace Operations Group had come to raid the war factories there, making landfall on the 13th. Garrisoning the planet were a trio of mercenary units, ranging in size from a company to a full regiment, but none were a match for the Dragoons. A feint towards the city of Port Galefry misled the defenders into thinking the objective of the raid lay elsewhere. When they rushed out of their defensive positions to intercept Alpha and Delta, Gamma maneuvered behind them and crushed their foe in a vice. The mech plant was captured on June 21st, its contents claimed in the name of the Dragon. Accompanying the Dragoons during their sojourn on Quinton was a small contingent from the 1st and 7th Sword of Light, the traditional guardians of the Draconis Combine capital, Luthien. The reason for their presence became obvious when Takashi Kurita himself put in an appearance in the final days of the operation. Not since the battle for Halstead Station had he taken to the field in person, and he was itching to fight alongside such a famous MechWarrior as Jamie Wolfe. Naturally, there were security concerns about the Coordinator crossing into Federated Sun's territory with only mercenaries for protection, however honourable those mercs claimed to be, and thus a cadre of loyal bodyguards would surround him at all times. One other individual of note was present on Quinton 4. In the 2 years since Dromanai, Minobu Tetsuhara had been denied the right to serve in any DCMS unit. When Wolf's Dragoons received their new contract, he was promoted to Chusa and called upon to act as their liaison officer, a cruel irony considering it was failing to kill Jamie that had led to his disgrace. Fate had another twist in store for him. During the campaign, the mercenaries loaned him a spare Valkyrie, a battle mech he used to rescue the mercenary commander when he again became separated from the rest of his command lance. Having twice saved Wolf's life, their destinies had become inexorably linked. The Lyran Commonwealth may have lost their largest and most professional mercenary asset, but not their most eccentric one. Ironically, it could be said that the latter had spawned as an offshoot from the former. Snord's Irregulars had spent the past year rebuilding on Clinton after the damage they had sustained on Alexandria, but in late 3022, they were rushed to Tamar to help reinforce a garrison under siege by the Draconis Combine. Their arrival on planet nearly resulted in a disaster for the unit when they were dropped off outside a city that had fallen to Kurita in the interim. But rather than try to escape from their clutches, Cranston boldly, perhaps crazily, advanced into the urban jungle. The Kuritan Taisho lost several lances of battle mechs trying to root them out. In the aftermath, the DCMS officer attempted to negotiate a new contract with the mercs, offering them a far larger payout to fight alongside the mustered soldiery than Steiner was currently paying them. Snord initially expressed interest, but in truth, he was only using these talks as a means to bargain with the Lyran Commonwealth for a better deal, which he got soon after. The world of Chara 3 within the Federation of Sky found itself the target of an unexpected aggressor in 3023. Perhaps as a result of the informal alliance between 3 of the successor states, the Capellan Confederation launched an attack against the Steiner realm, one of very few confrontations in their history. Pacifica, or Old Stormy as the planet was known to the locals, had a sizable population of around 4 billion, and was also a crucial layover for diplomats travelling between the Federated Suns and Lyran Commonwealth. Liao looked to disrupt that activity. The ensuing battle proved costly for both sides in terms of materiel, but it did demonstrate to the LCAF that they would need to defend from 3 opponents going forwards. Duke Aldo Lestrade used this in his condemnation of the FedCom Accords, since it seemed to guarantee that his territory in particular would suffer the most if ties between the 2 nations increased. Duke Friedrich Steiner has been another outspoken critic of the Union, marshalling the anti-Davion faction that existed in the Protectorate of Donegal behind him. Many of their peers saw the Federated Sons as warmongers on par with the Draconis Combine, and feared that an alliance with them would simply mean Lyran wealth going to fund a foreign realm's military expansionism. Regrettably for the Commonwealth, the power bloc opposed to Katrina Steiner again voiced their displeasure over her apparent favoritism towards a unit of washed-up has-beens like the Kellhounds. Within the past few years, they had earned Aldo Lestrade's displeasure by tricking him out of his share of a salvaged Leopard-class dropship in the aftermath of a Kuritan raid on Skondia. By creating an artificial lake to flood the crash site, they were able to claim the wreck for themselves under an obscure maritime law. Sensing the mood, the famed mercs accepted a 3-year contract from the Federated Sons to train up the Robinson March militia, depriving the realm of another of their best units, albeit a smaller one than Wolf's Dragoons. Snord's Irregulars, meanwhile, had redeployed to the more familiar Marik border, where they took up the defense of the water purification plant on Hyde. When the FWLM next came calling, the raiders were easily seen off by the veteran mercs. A year later, the famous treasure hunters were at it again, this time on Fekta, where they had located an ancient Star League derelict, a half-buried Colossus-class dropship. The SLDF vintage technology inside raised the level of the Irregulars' gear to the point where they were among the best equipped mercenaries anywhere in the Inner Sphere. The arrival of Wolf's Dragoons along the Federated Sons border turned what had previously been a relatively sedate theatre into a hotbed of activity. The mercenaries soared out 3023 by hitting Cimarron, David, and Elidera, and then launched a flurry of raids the following year, striking Bergman's Planet, Breed, Clethandu, Leblanc, Lima, Marduk, New Iverson, and Corsidon. While fighting on the latter, the so-called Queen of Spades, Natasha Kirensky, narrowly avoided a headhunter mission undertaken by Linden's company, cheating death for the umpteenth time in her storied career. The Black Widows spent the rest of 3024 repelling hostile actions at Proserpina and then New Aberdeen, where they faced off against the famous Iridani Lighthorse again. The excitement wasn't over yet for her independent company, as she was redeployed to deal with an emerging threat along the Corwood Periphery border. Way back in 3003, Federated Sons captain Helmar Valasek went rogue. He spent the next 16 years terrorizing his home nation, and even ComStar, all the while gathering a band of loyal subordinates to his side. In 3019, he settled on the isolated backwater of Santander 5, a world notorious for pirate activity going back over a century. Santander's Killers, as the Bandit King had christened his unit, had raided as far into the Draconis Combine as Unity. In May 3023, New Caledonia came under attack from a full battalion of rundown battlemechs suspected to be his. Another incursion at Susquehanna in 3024 was the final straw for the DCMS, and so they dispatched the Black Widow in the hopes that she could catch the renegade in her web. A raid on Thule later that year was the opportunity they had been waiting for. When Helmar and his killers arrived, they waltzed straight into a trap. The pirates sustained punishing losses, the survivors forced to flee with their tails tucked between their legs. Wolf's Dragoons recalled their forces soon after, but Kurita chose to send some of their own troops to Santander to deal with Valasek for good. It was a fool's errand, and one that ended inconclusively, as they failed to locate his base of operations. They only succeeded in furnishing the Periphery warlord with more salvaged machines after stumbling into an ambush themselves. not everyone within the Draconis Combine was happy with the general conduct of Wolf's Dragoons. Their rowdy behaviour across the worlds they were garrisoning, particularly the Black Widows, was a constant headache for their professional soldiery liaison officer. The traditionally reserved and conservative Kuritan society struggled to adapt to their presence. Minobu Tetsuhara, who had become somewhat of a Dragoon legend for his exploits, at least had enough standing among the mercenaries to be able to reel them in when things went too far, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. On November 12, 3024, Grieg Samsonov, warlord of the Galadin military district, arrived at Anting for an audience with Jamie regarding Epsilon's perceived lack of discipline on a recent mission. Particularly grating to the old-fashioned officer was Wilhelmina Korst of Gamma, whose worst offence was daring to be a woman colonel. The high-ranking officer demanded that Wolf place his units at the command of proper Kuritan officers, which he flatly refused to do. It was a frosty exchange, one that has characterised their relationship ever since their arrival within his region of the Draconis Combine. Grieg was not in the habit of being told no. After parting, he went straight to the top with his complaints, presenting the coordinator with circumspect evidence of their apparent misdeeds. Although the warlord was a trusted friend of Takashi's, Kurita made it abundantly clear to him that he was not to strain relations with the Dragoons, a unit for which he had a personal fondness. "I do not want to lose the service of those mercenaries," the successor lord told him, but whether Samsonov interpreted that as it was meant remains to be seen. There was no chance that a campaign as destructive as McCarron's Long March could take place without the Federated Sons looking to get vengeance. Such is the cyclical nature of the Succession Wars. With Wolf Dragoons pressing them hard, there wasn't much the AFS could spare for the Capellan front, but they nonetheless managed to launch a handful of raids in the summer of 3024. Unfortunately, the Maskarovka had been able to determine their targets ahead of time, allowing Laurel's Legion to blunt their attacks with relative ease. Riding that high, the Confederation dispatched Marsha Gamma's legionnaires to New Aragon, but the recently formed Borderers Regiment was more than enough to protect the planet from a mere company. One of the key goals of the FedCom Accords was to raise the standard of the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces. To that end, the two successor states organised the Alliance Games to take place in August 3024. The planet New Earth played host to a regiment each of the AFS and LCAF, Marshal Arden Sortek's Davion Heavy Guards, and Colonel Frederick Steiner's 10th Lyran Guards. It was the first time since the final Martial Olympiad all the way back in 2736 during the waning days of the Star League that two rival militaries had faced off in peaceful competition and not actual conflict. That's not to say the fighting wasn't fierce. National pride was on the line, as were the individual commanders' reputations. Had they been fighting for real, the contest would have ended in a bloodbath. The Davion complement won a decisive victory over their Steiner counterparts. It was a loss that the Lyran High Command hoped to learn from, but the stubborn colonel was so embarrassed by his defeat that if anything it closed his mind to any alternative military theories or tactics. Although Frederick remained an outspoken critic of the Union, his humiliation did serve to undermine his support among the anti-Davion faction. The Alliance Games had served their purpose, and to further strengthen ties between the two nations, it was decided to schedule another event for the following August, which again the AFS won handily. Watching from the sidelines were the Capellan Confederation, Draconis Combine, and Freewells League. It was clear to them that their ancient rivals were forging a powerful union, and so perhaps in response to the war games now underway, The three successor lords met again to ratify the Concord of Capellan on August 10, 3024. With this act, the Inner Sphere was formally divided into two opposing camps, just as Primus Julian Tiepolo had desired. If the Third Succession War was truly coming to an end, how many years of peace could mankind count on before ComStar once again provided the spark that would doom our species to yet another apocalyptic conflict? The Lyran Intelligence Corps had been collaborating with the Davion agencies these past 2 years to identify prospective targets for their own offensive. To help them with this endeavour, they acquired the services of the 12th Star Guards, whose 4 regiments went some way to making up for the loss of Wolf's Dragoons a couple of years earlier. The LIC settled on 3 systems for their campaign, stretching along their border with the Draconis Combine: Port Moresby, Kars, and Severin. The first 2 were taken without too much of a fight, although a distant cousin of the Archons, Pete Steiner, was one of the casualties of the former conquest. To prevent Kurita from being able to move one of their best units to reinforce the planetary garrisons, the Waco Rangers were dispatched to Voltaise on August 25th, where the 5th Sword of Light was based. The bloodiest struggle was set to take place within the hotly disputed Severin system. Garrisoned by a trio of DCMS battlemech regiments, in June 3024, the LCAF dispatched 3 of their best to pry it from the dragon's talons. Among them were Winfield's brigade, survivors from a prior engagement there that had seen the old Winfield's guards disbanded. They proved to be the decisive factor in the campaign, and by late December, the mustered soldiery were in retreat. Severin's trauma wasn't over yet, however, as just 1 day after the enemy departed, a nuclear processing plant detonated in a final act of sabotage, spreading radiation across the surrounding area. Any head of state must accept that during times of war there is an ever-present danger that someone might target them personally. Planning for every contingency isn't always possible, but an alert security force and proactive intelligence agency can help minimize the risks. However, the challenge of protecting a successor lord from jeopardy is greatly compounded when the threat comes from within. Takashi Kurita was no stranger to such peril. Even in his first year as coordinator, a relative of one of those killed during the political purge he had carried out following the death of his father rushed him with a knife, and before any of his bodyguards could intervene, managed to plunge the blade into his chest. Another noble might have gone down at that moment, but the dragon is forged in fire. Unfazed by the terrible wound, Takashi defiantly reached out and grabbed his assailant by the head. Fueled by pure rage, Kurita twisted hard and broke the would-be assassin's neck. He had their corpse strung up as an example, along with a number of the pathetic guards that had failed him. The wedding plot of 3019 almost spelled the end for both the coordinator and his son when an explosion rocked his Leopard on final approach to the starport, but he had survived by leaping from the doomed craft aboard a battle mech. In a repeat of that action 2 years later, another bomb detonated aboard his dropship. This time, Takashi flew to safety using a docked aerospace fighter. In 3023, a courtesan pricked him with a poison needle. Kurita spent 2 weeks on death's door until he at last started to make a recovery. The successor lord handled all of these with his trademark stoicism. Such hazards were well known to him by this point. An ISF investigation struggled to find explicit evidence as to who was behind the attempts on his life, but the spectre of Marcus Kurita was clearly felt. In December 3024, the coordinator made the controversial decision to appoint his cousin to command of the Otomo. The belief was that any further attempts on his life would reflect badly on Marcus, as it would indicate he had failed in his duty, and thus would be dissuaded from carrying out such actions. His appointment drove a wedge between the ruling Kurita and his son Theodore, as the younger man pointed out that their relative had already forsaken any trace of familial loyalty or honor by orchestrating the prior assassination efforts, and now was better placed than ever to do so again. Furthermore, command of the Otomo was historically a position given to the future head of the Kuritan dynasty, one that he himself had held prior to his ascension. Ultimately, the Chusa was proven correct a few months later, when Takashi's Battlemaster was sabotaged and rigged to explode with him locked inside. Only another miraculous escape spared the Successor Lord's life. There is no doubt that Marcus is ruthless enough to try again, and so it seems inevitable that the cousins will one day come to blows. All that can really be said on the matter is that the coordinator should consider himself lucky that Maximilian Liao is not currently opposed to him. For the first time in over a century, borders between the successor states were starting to go quiet. Before things fizzled out entirely, Strategic Military Director Pavel Rydzik hoped to make some final spinward gains from the Federated Suns. Davion Intelligence was reporting a surge in activity within the St. Ives commonality, and anticipated an attack on either Atlas or Redfield. It was the latter that the senior colonel had his sights on, and in early 3025, the invasion commenced. It was the first time in over 15 years that the Confederation had attempted to conquer a world, and with Blandford's Grenadiers leading the way, backed by Saint-Cyr's Armoured Grenadiers and the dreaded Death Commandos, it was inevitable that Redfield would fall. In the following weeks, the elite commando team moved on to Stein's Folly. There they sabotaged the system's Zenith observation post, to prevent word of a second task force comprising elements of the Big Mac and 1st St. Ives Armoured Cavalry and commanded by Pavel Rydzik himself from reaching the planet below until it was too late to organise an effective defence. The meagre garrison was easily overrun. With their objective secure, Capellan construction crews immediately set about work on the second phase of the operation. For you see, Maximilian Liao had planned a far more audacious and insidious venture than simply taking a couple of worlds from a rival state. Now all he needed to do was wait for Hansa Davion to take the bait. At the dawn of 3025, Wolf's Dragoons were about to launch what was going to be their most important mission yet in service to the Draconis Combine. Beta and Gamma regiments led the charge, supported by the Assault Battalion Zeta and the specialists of 7th Commando. They reached the Deschler system on January 4th, as part of an operation to seize the two major battlemech factories there, and hopefully clear a path for a full occupation force to move in. Defending the planet were the 4th Davion Guards RCT and Raman Draconis March Militia. Both units were dug in around the complexes. Dislodging them would take a Herculean effort. As Beta approached their landing zone, a heavy aerospace screen intercepted their dropships, severely damaging 2 of them, forcing the rest of the regiments to divert from their intended target. To prevent the same problem befalling her unit, Wilhelmina Korst redirected Gamma to prioritize capturing the airbase instead. Though the facility was taken, these actions did give the garrison more time to solidify their position and lay traps for the approaching mercs. Elsewhere along the front, Other elements of Wolf's Dragoons were busy fighting off numerous Davion raids at El Nair, Capra, Dela Cruz, and Marlowe's Rift. Anticipating further strikes, Epsilon and the support battalion prepared for quick deployment to whatever system called for aid first. What they hadn't anticipated was that the armed forces of the Federated Suns were heading straight for them. The first Chisholm Raiders reached Thestria early in 3025 and began running rings around the defenders. They always seemed to be one step ahead of the Dragoons and had an answer for every action they took. To Colonel Baxter Arbuthnot, it felt as if someone within the Combine was feeding them information, intelligence they used to humiliate his unit and make off with vast quantities of spare parts, supplies the mercenaries desperately needed. Why someone would want to tarnish Wolf's Dragoon's reputation in this manner remained a mystery. Back on Deschler, resistance was so fierce and progress so slow that it took 3 full months for the assault team to get within sight of their objectives. Colonel Andrei Shostakovich had to call in the Zeta reserves in order to finally break through the perimeter and reach the mech works, only to find the whole base had been stripped of anything valuable by the retreating Davion guards. The 2 AWFS units consolidated their remaining strength around the second factory complex. On April 17th, 7th Commando were able to infiltrate through the rear of the enemy's line and make a direct assault against their headquarters. Although the elite infantry battalion was chased off, the damage they caused succeeded in undermining Davion's position on World. The next day, with Dragoons closing in on all sides, the ranking officer surrendered to the mercenaries. It is a tragedy that such a hard-fought victory ultimately proved to be futile. When Korsht got back in contact with her superiors, she found the whole region was in chaos. The situation along the Davion Kurita front had changed dramatically over the past few months. There was no longer any occupation force coming to relieve them. Every available unit was being redirected to assist what was fast developing into the defining moment of the entire Third Succession War, what would go down in history as the largest battle mech engagement since the Battle for Terra that brought down the Amaris Empire. Just one jump away, an enormous Star League base had been uncovered on Galtor, and the 2 great houses were throwing everything they had at the world to secure its contents. Long overdue, I finally get off my ass and get another chapter of the Third Succession War finished. 3 whole months have passed, more than that actually, since I last uploaded an episode in this series. This has been a very long recording session, almost 4 hours, so I want to keep this outro quite brief here. I think it should be sufficient to say that the end is finally within sight. We have reached the year 3025, where we started way back in August of 2021. Could never have imagined it would take this long just to get up to the starting point of that introductory video, where I teased the Battle of Galtor and Operation Doppelganger, which is about to commence on Stein's Folly. Now, as I've said before, I'm going to leave a full explanation of what exactly that later operation entails for later, and make it the opening to the next series when that comes. But what I found when I was struggling to write this episode, was just how difficult it was to do a proper conclusion to the Third Succession War in this episode, knowing that I wanted to dedicate the next one solely to the Battle for Galtor. It felt so strange examining that very specific event in great detail and then suddenly transitioning into an overarching review of the past 2 centuries. So what I'm going to do instead is much like the Shadow War that commenced this series. I'm going to have a very short episode at the end of it where we're going to look at the tallies and count all the systems that had changed hands, look at the units that were destroyed and other statistics of that nature. And I'll also kind of wrap up the final events at the end of 3025 at the beginning of that episode. What takes place after Galtor in those final few months before ComStar officially declares an end to the conflict, even though in truth there was still raiding going on non-stop up until the beginning of the Fourth Succession War, albeit more limited in scope. Anyway, that's really all I've got to say about this one. So to wrap things up, I'll just end by saying thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you did, please leave me a comment below letting me know. I love reading them all. I try to respond to as many of you as I can. You can give the video a like, and sharing it around with other people who you think might be interested really helps bring in a new audience to the channel. So I'd greatly appreciate that if you think it's worth it. Normally at this point in the outro, I also mention my Patreon, but as I'm going to explain there when this video goes live, I am pausing that for the time being until this series is finished. To keep it brief, I don't think it's right to keep that running when I've been able to dedicate less time to it this year than I had in 2024. And I don't feel very great about taking 6 months worth of donations from people and only having produced 3 videos in this series during that time. Once the Third Succession War is completely concluded and I have uploaded that compilation video, which is almost certainly gonna hit 10 hours, I'll maybe look at reopening it then, depending on how much else I've got going on at the time. I know it's always a concern for people that I'm stopping this series when we reach 3025. It's not my intention, but I do need to acknowledge that I have slowed down a bit, so we will just see how we go from here. So thank you one final time, and I hope to see you again soon for another video.